Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to General Misconduct. This is episode 1 of our series on Civil War General Braxton Bragg. I know it's been a while since I've uploaded a new episode. It's been about almost 2 months now since I uploaded the Conrad von Hotzendorf episodes. And if you haven't already listened to those, go ahead and give those a listen. Obviously, you don't need to have any context from those episodes to enjoy today's episode. But, I mean, if you haven't already, go ahead and give those couple of episodes a listen. And if you want the bonus episode for that one, it's also available on the Patreon. If you want to become a member, I have membership starting out at only $1 a month, and I'll give you access to any content that I've already posted on there and then future content. It also helps the show to keep going. It just gives me another incentive to put a little bit more time and effort into these episodes. Again, I know it's been a while since I've uploaded one, and I can't guarantee that an upload schedule is going to get any better in the next couple months, just because the seasons are changing up here, and that means I'm going to be spending a lot more time at work. But I could drone on and on about my own personal problems. Let's get into today's episode. As I said, today's episode is about Confederate General Braxton Bragg. Pretty infamous guy. If you're even just kind of a casual student or casual fan of Civil War history, then you've definitely heard of Braxton Bragg. I don't know if he's in the kind of general knowledge, what they're teaching in school these days. I imagine he probably gets brought up maybe once or twice. You've definitely heard the name Bragg before. He's actually the guy that Fort Bragg, North Carolina, is named after. It's also the reason why that military post is getting its name changed to Fort Liberty, which, there's a lot of different feelings about that going on in the military community, specifically with units posted there. 82nd and Special Forces Command are both at Fort Bragg. It's the home of the airborne. So there are a lot of, different takes being made about the fort changing their name from Bragg to Liberty. Some saying the name could have been better. Some don't want a name change at all, whatever. I've always thought that it's ironic that the fort where our country's most elite units are stationed at is named after Braxton Bragg. And you're going to learn why in these next couple episodes of why that's ironic, because although that post is home to the most elite units in the U.S. Army, Braxton Bragg was kind of he's often considered one of the worst generals the Confederacy had, and to a degree, I mean, he does cause a lot of problems for the Confederacy, specifically towards the end of the war. He made a lot of blunders during his campaigns, but we're going to discuss that in more depth. It's not so much that he was the worst general the South had. The South had a lot of incompetent commanders who had no prior military experience. And to say Braxton Bragg was the worst general of the South is a bit of a stretch. He was definitely the most hated man in the following years, following the fall of the Confederacy and the end of the Civil War. He's often remembered as being the most hated man in the Confederacy because he is kind of the scapegoat, the guy who is to blame for the fall of Tennessee and the eventual siege and destruction at Atlanta, and ultimately for Sherman's March to the Sea that occurred in late 1864. So that's kind of the big reason of why he's remembered as being this infamous figure, not only for the North, but for the South as well. So the one thing those two sides agree on is that Braxton Bragg was a, kind of a bastard. And, I'm going to talk about it in this episode and the next episode and try to cover his life in more detail, specifically looking at his generalship and his military career. This episode is going to focus mainly on his early life and his career in the U.S. Army prior to the Civil War. So his generalship and the things that he's infamous for, that's going to be mostly talked about in the next episode. But today I just want to kind of give the groundwork, get to know this guy, figure out why he ends up performing the way that he performs during the Civil War, So in order to understand that, we're going to have to look at his life prior to the Civil War, find out what kind of a man this was, try to give him more of a fair shake. The book that I read to kind of prepare for this episode, and am still reading, attempted to do the same thing. It's a book by Earl J. Hess. It's called Braxton Bragg, the Most Hated Man of the Confederacy. If you're interested in finding out where I got most of my material for this episode, you can read that book. Especially with this episode, I'm leaning almost entirely on his work, just because there aren't a lot of books devoted to the study of Braxton Bragg in particular. There are some, but a lot of them, is on par with what you usually get from Civil War like biographies, really just military history biographies in the U.S. in general. A lot of the time, they're not really good as far as like academically going. They fall into one of two categories, at least for like Civil War biographies. I put them into one of two categories, which is either lost cause romanticism, or like this idea of putting either like if they're from the South, they become a punching bag, so it's kind of the flip side of lost cause romanticism, or if they're a Northern general, it just portrays them as like this, giant among men, which is just something you find in a lot of, again, military history biographies about any general in U.S. history, Confederate or Union, Civil War or not. It's always comes into one of those two. It's either they over-glorify the man or they trash the man. And that's the case with Braxton Bragg as well. A lot of the materials out there for him are either one or the other. It's either lost cause, Southern romanticism, or it's the opposite. So it's pretty difficult sometimes, depending on who I'm studying, to find a kind of non-biased source. It's definitely hard whenever you're studying the Civil War. The Civil War can be a touchy topic, and there's going to be a lot of Civil War episodes. I'm going to be covering a lot of different Civil War generals, so I'm going to try to dance around having any kind of, bias when it comes to it. I'm just going to try to give the history of these guys, and I'm going to try to give Braxton Bragg a fair shake too. Obviously, this is general misconduct, so I'm going to be highlighting the, I say the good, the bad, and the ugly, but it's mostly the bad and the ugly on this podcast that I highlight. But I'm going to try to give him a fair shake. Again, the book that I read by Earl J. Hess tries to give the man a better shake, or a fair shake rather. He does cover, obviously, the negatives. That's what I liked about this book, is that it wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to try to defend the image of Braxton Bragg, and it falls into that lost cause, those tropes. Hess doesn't really do that from what I've read so far in the book. He gives, he gives a fair shake for Braxton Bragg, kind of better explains why he performed the way that he did in the Civil War. So without further ado, let's jump right into the history of the man himself. So Braxton Bragg was born on March 22nd, 1817 in Warrenton, North Carolina, to a man named Thomas Bragg and his wife Margaret. He was one of 12 siblings. Thomas was a construction contractor and a slave owner, and again was able to support a very large family. Braxton had several brothers among that group of 12, including his brother John, who served as a congressman and a judge in the state of Alabama, Thomas Jr., who served as governor of North Carolina and eventually would serve as the attorney general for the Confederate States. His brother Alexander was an architect, his brother Dunbar was a merchant, and he had another brother, William, who died as a soldier during the Civil War. Hess doesn't really discuss his sisters at all. I couldn't really find any information on them, but he had 6 other sisters. His mother, Margaret, was arrested for the murder of a freedman, presumably during the pregnancy of when she was pregnant with Braxton. She was jailed while she was pregnant and awaited trial, and was eventually found not guilty by a jury. For more context, the reason given for shooting this guy was that he spoke impertinently to her. So I mean, it's antebellum South. If a black man does literally anything to a white woman, he could have done absolutely nothing. I mean, the reason that they give is, again, spoke impertinently to her, which, again, could be, like, absolutely nothing. The fact that she was found not guilty shouldn't be a surprise to anybody if you know anything about the time period. Again, a black man could look at a white woman in the wrong way, and, you know, any action that she takes against him after that point is going to be pretty much overlooked. So, again, she was likely acquitted of this due to the fact that, again, it was the antebellum South, and no jury was going to jail a married, pregnant white woman for shooting a black man, whether he was a freedman or a slave. Historians have speculated that Braxton's later knowledge of this event as a child had a great effect on him. Not necessarily that his mother had shot a black man, but that she had served time in jail, and it caused him to constantly need to prove his standing in society. So, again, he doesn't know about this for a while growing up, but he does eventually learn about his mother being put in jail for a time for this crime. And the way that it affects Braxton isn't like, oh my goodness, my mother shot somebody. It was like, oh my goodness, my mother was in jail for any reason whatsoever. And this had a profound effect on his mind and kind of how he would act later on in his life. He constantly needed to prove that he was something more, just because his mother had spent, a short time in jail, but eventually was found not guilty of a crime that she absolutely committed. So yeah, it's a weird reason as to why he's going to act the way he acts for the rest of his life, but that is the reason given. Moving on. So Braxton was always destined to be a military officer, and he was able to attend West Point in the early 1830s, and he graduated in 1837. He was number 5 in a class of 50, so he ended up in the top 10% of his class. That class included future colleagues John C. Pemberton and Jubal Early, both of whom he would serve alongside in the American Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, and Joe Hooker, who was the one of the several commanders of the General of the Army of the Potomac. For those of you who don't know, that was like the main Union army that was fighting in Virginia against the Lee for most of the war. That was the one that McClellan led, George Meade later led, and then again Joe Hooker led at one point. Ambrose Burnside led it at another time. It was kind of the main force that was, like, if you study Civil War history at all, especially the war in the East or the war in Virginia, where 60% of the battles in the Civil War were fought, the unit that you'll constantly hear about is the Army of the Potomac. And again, Joe Hooker would go on to command that force for a short time, and he was in the same class as Braxton Bragg. So Bragg graduates in, again, 1837, number 5 of 50, so clearly he is a smart guy. The fact that he was able to get into West Point, especially at that time in history, shows that he was qualified. It wasn't enough back then that nepotism would help you get into West Point. Obviously, there are going to be cases of that, but West Point is extremely selective at the time. Again, it's a class of 50 that he graduates with. You have to understand the size of the U.S. Army in the 1830s was minuscule. It was mostly a frontier force, very few men in it, just a few thousand here or there. Up into the Civil War, the numbers are going to be extremely low. So if you wanted to, serve in the Army at all, it was hard to get into, especially as an officer, and then it's going to be extremely difficult to get into West Point. So the fact that Bragg was able to get in and graduate near the top of his class speaks pretty highly to the mind of Braxton Bragg, at least in these early years. So again, he graduates and he's immediately signed to the 3rd Artillery. I don't know if that's a battery or a regiment or a battalion. Just said 3rd Artillery in the book. I'm guessing it was a battery based on the context of the U.S. Army at this period in time. So he goes and serves in the Second Seminole War down in Florida, which had just broken out. Doesn't see any kind of combat while he's down there. He ends up catching malaria, though, in 1838, and is put on sick leave due to that. despite the fact that, again, his service in the Second Seminole War was,